have our handout here, and this is actually a different style of teaching that I have today. I took a few days this week to go back over the notes, and I'm glad I did. I understand when Paul was on trial, and one of the guys listening to him says, "Paul, your advanced learning has turned you insane." I understand the feeling. This is a very deep subject, and to narrow it down into bite-sized chunks is extremely difficult for me. So please be patient, understand. It's not, well, there were two ladies that worked with me when we were there in Roseville, and their help was invaluable. I still appreciate it today. How to take the gospel messages in Scripture in order to put it down on the level of children, even all the way up through adults. It was very difficult, but their help was invaluable. And we did create curriculum every year when I was there. They helped me to put it on the different age levels. They were in the education system, and so I dedicate this series of lessons, I guess you might say, to them. Appreciate their work very much. What I have for you today is a handout. Today starts the season many in the Christian world will call Advent. Today is the first day of Advent. It's the 4 Sundays leading up to what is traditionally thought to be the birth of Christ. The word Advent, as you see on your outline there, it's actually I've got 2 different handouts going here, so I'm going to have to go back and forth. This was from a class I taught on the life of Christ at the college, and I've just taken the first parts of it because what I really did back then at the time was, in bringing Christ into the world, that was his advent. And so this is part of those lessons that I created for that. The Greek actually is the word epiphaneia that you see at the top. Our English word epiphany comes from that word. And it's when something finally makes sense. You got an epiphany. You see it in the whodunit, the detective movies with Sherlock Holmes and others. When it finally dawns on them, they put all the clues together and they figure out what happened. That was an epiphany. It literally means to appear, to arrive. In vernacular in English today, show up. You're finally here. Just like in family get-togethers, you always have someone who waits until the time you say you're going to meet to leave their house and get there, right? Finally, they showed up. That is what the word epiphany meant. The Latins, once they adopted Christianity, their theologians brought the concept over, but in Latin, the word is adventus. And we have the advent there. It's the coming or an arrival of a person or an event. Your birthday is an adventus. It comes every year. And anniversaries, special days, 4th of July, Thanksgiving. When the day of, it is in Latin, adventus. All right, this here I mentioned last week in the introductory lesson on Advent. It is a biblical subject. And to me, my mind, if it's in the Bible, you can talk about it anytime you want. And to me, 99% of the Christian world is talking and thinking about it. If we're going to help them finish the story, let's take them from where they are and move from there. A lot of the work is already done for us. You might as well not reinvent the wheel, just take them and move them along. That's what Aquila and Priscilla did with Apollos. He was a very forceful preacher. They didn't denounce him, they didn't disfellowship him, they took him home for dinner and filled him in on the
Ethiopian eunuch. He began where he was reading and taught him Christ.
Okay, that is coming up too. That's great. The Spirit works every time, doesn't it, Rick? Yeah, he was reading from one of the prophecies and then finished the story for him. You know, let God help you start it and get it going. He drums up the interest. All we have to do is just finish the story. And that's what we're doing this time of year. In Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, read that from last week. The Epiphany of Jesus. Didn't realize until after Jesus had shown up that there wasn't just one, but two. There are two epiphanies. We are living in the time period between the two epiphanies of God. We had the first one already, and that was to prepare the people and get them ready and cleaned up and washed, ready for the second one. The second one is yet to come. When will it be? God knows. God knows, and that has to be good enough. Yes. We are on a need-to-know basis. And when the disciples asked Jesus after his resurrection, because here Jesus came, they believed in him, then they killed him, they went back to fishing, he shows up again, another epiphany, and then zoom, back into heavens. Then, it's the first time it was ever revealed that there's going to be another one, the ultimate epiphany. Okay, so we're living between those two. What Paul calls the already, but not yet. We're living in between the times. And Paul says in Titus chapter 2, Titus came out of paganism, so he had to learn all this other stuff. Imagine how long it would take to learn that. Paul had to take 13 years to unlearn everything he had been taught, which was distorted by Satan very effectively, still doing that today, and then relearning it the right way. And too often we have to do that in our lives as well. So it's good to be reminded of how we have to be reminded and get back to the original truth and not believe something just because someone we appreciate and respect taught us this way. We have to go back to the beginning. The first epiphany was at his birth, which we'll try to get into that in the next week or so. Oh, the first day of Advent today, there are four, actually. One is hope, which is with the prophets. Don't give up. Someone's coming. And that's where we're living today. Don't give up. Someone is coming back. It's not over yet. Because did Jesus really leave us? No. He said in his final statements before his ascension, I am with you always. And he used the word I am. That's the name God gave to Moses for himself. Yahweh. I am. Before Abraham was born, I am. And they picked up rocks to kill him for blasphemy. They knew exactly what he was saying. Satan had done such a good job to distort the truth that when the truth was standing right there with them, they killed it. But you really couldn't kill it, could you? He's alive. So when we celebrate that great sacrifice he provided for us, remember, he's not dead. Yeah, it was sad. It was a bad thing that had to happen. Look what we did to Jesus. Let's rejoice, though. He's alive forevermore, and we are covered and forgiven. That's the time period we're living in. But when it gets to Revelation, he says, I'm coming again. I'm coming soon, he says. I don't know about you, but 2,000 years is not very soon. Can't it be right now, please? It's not time yet. We have to go on God's timing, not our own. All right. The second epiphany will be at his promised return. I mentioned, and there is so much to say here, I can't do it in a nutshell. I have to give you the scriptures. Take a look at it this week. And you're thinking about all the preparations that God went through. Today I called it divine preparations. What I have planned for next week is the final preparations. It was so distorted by Satan that it took so long for God to put it all together. And if we're not careful, we'll get it. Well, I think we've distorted it immeasurably even today. We just are so distracted by our world. But the promise there in Acts chapter 1 is when Jesus left, went back up into heaven, the disciples are looking up like, wait a second, where'd you go? Now what are we going to do? And the angel said, what are you doing looking up in the air? Come on, we've got work to do. The same way he left, he'll be coming back. Was there any warning to what's taken? No. Is there going to be any warning when he comes back? No. So get busy, stay busy. Blessed is the servant who is working when his master returns.
Be ready.
Be ready every moment. And yet, it's so distorted today that people think there's going to be signs. And we have had people lately that have tried to decide what time it is. At the time there in Acts chapter 1, the disciples asked Jesus, now that he's risen from the dead, okay, now? You're going to restore the kingdom of Israel now? Because just like with Moses, and Jesus, Matthew's gospel is all comparing Jesus and Moses. It almost verbatim. Moses brought them out into the wilderness, out of slavery, into a desert where they picked up their food off the ground and got water from a rock. And then went away back on the mountain. Never saw hide nor hair of him again for 30 days. So, well, we can't stay here. That's when they got their minds together and did something, can I say the word stupid in a church building? They decided, you know what? We don't know what's happened to this guy. He's gone. Let's go back to Egypt. Isn't that typical even today?
It shows how impatient people really are.
So when Jesus reappears, it's a good question the disciples ask. Is it time now? You're going to go away for another 40 days like Moses did and then come back? Is there still some things put up? Jesus says, it's not for you to know. Well, that's very offensive, isn't it? I have the right to know. It's not for you to know the times and the seasons, and yet from that time on, even in the letter to the Thessalonians, see, read there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, they were trying to figure out the timing of his return. When people asked Jesus for the signs, he says, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes. And then the end will come. No signs. His return will be the sign of his return.
Can you imagine the rush people would have if they knew a time that he was coming? I mean, the week before that time would be...
Until that time, I'd be playing.
Exactly.
And I believe firmly what you just said, Patsy. That's why he doesn't tell us. He wants us to work at being ready. Because if we know the timing, and that happened with Hezekiah. Hezekiah was given a certain number of years to live. And he ruined them. The next son who took over for him, God said, that's the last straw. You guys are out of here. Manasseh ruined everything. It would have been better for Hezekiah just not to know. So there again, that's a lesson to us. It's best not to know.
If the Holy Spirit had not come upon these writers of the Scriptures, they have no idea what Jesus was. Because they understood him after he was gone. During his lifetime, they're scratching their head and saying, what's he talking about? Right?
Right, exactly. And what you just said is perfect proof that these scriptures are not man-made.
Exactly.
No human would write the stories that we have as they are. You don't have your prized king fooling around with another man's wife and then killing him. No human would write that story. The first Epiphany. God comes here as a human and no one recognizes it? You got to bring 3 foreigners from another country? You got to scare some riffraff shepherds just so that somebody realizes something happened? No human would write that story. Even the resurrection story is not believable if you were just to read it. That's proof, though, that it's not man-made. The heroes of the Bible, they were not the best examples to follow. So, that is, I appreciate you bringing that up. But there again, we have Jesus coming back. He's never really left us, and he wasn't away from them before the first time. He's always been. He's the one who was, who is, and who will be to come. The eternal one. And that's what the name Yahweh, as the Jews would have pronounced it if they allowed themselves to say his name. They changed it to Adonai, Lord. So the newer translations that have picked up on that concept there and have seen it in Scripture are capitalized L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And it's in some places that will amaze you. I hope to bring a couple of those out today with the little time that we have. All right. So today, the first day of Advent is hope. Second is peace. Little town of Bethlehem, just going about its business, and there's God right there in their midst. And they didn't know it. He's laying, wrapped in cloths, laying in a feeding trough. See, no human would write that. Now, you have the joy of when they realized that the Epiphany has happened. And then the fourth day of Advent is love. The angels could not keep quiet. They had to burst into joyous celebration. And that should bug us when it comes to time we realize Jesus is not dead. He is alive. People in the early church didn't just sit quietly and think about a dead man on a cross. It was a celebration. Peter and Jude both call it what the early church called it, a love feast. Like what we will take part of after our worship this morning. A love feast. Because after the sacrifices, they were to take the meat that didn't get burned up in the sacrifice to a special room and have a fellowship meal. A celebration. Their sins are forgiven. Didn't last long though, did it? As soon as they got home, they realized, got to get another lamb, go back to Jerusalem, got to kill it again. Because they messed up. It wasn't permanent. It was a temporary fix. Jesus, when he came to provide the sacrifice in his first Epiphany, his sacrifice was perfect once for all time. But that had to be, the distortions had to be overcome and relearned. And Paul called that gospel of Christ a scandal. Stumbling block to Jews because of all the distortions they believed. And foolishness to Gentiles because no human could make that up. And for humans, if we can't make it up, we don't want any part of it. Even today, we make God in our image. He agrees with us. He thinks like I do. What kind of distortions do we have today? Paul will describe the people of his day, and you'd think he's talking about today. No one is righteous. Nope. Not one. They've all gone astray. And he was quoting Isaiah and other Old Testament writers. Nothing has changed. So, okay. The world needed to be prepared for this great act. And there are many different preparations that you can see. In the scriptures themselves, from Genesis 3 through the end of Malachi. And Malachi was not the last of the prophets written. They're not listed in the order in which they were written. They are listed in categories from longest to shortest. But it is true, Malachi was the last of the minor prophets. And minor doesn't mean insignificant. It just means they were called to a short service with a short message. The major prophets had a bigger experience, most of their life, and a lot of writings. That's how they were categorized. But as Malachi ends, it is the call to be prepared and ready for an epiphany. So from Genesis 3 through the end of what we know as divine inspired scripture, it's all about one thing, one person. It's all preparation for the epiphany of God, in whom we call Jesus, which is from the Latin Jesus. Actually, no. Yeah, Latin Jesus. It's actually who borrowed it from the Greek, Yesu, borrowed from the Aramaic and Hebrew is Yeshua. The name Yeshua means God, Yahweh, saves. So that's all about Jesus. John chapter 5, Jesus was upset with the Pharisees because they searched the scriptures in minute detail. Yet he says, they're the ones that talk about me, but you refuse to come to me. And he had proved everything those scriptures said to prove he was true. And they wouldn't believe it because it wasn't what they had always been taught. He was so different. Okay, supposed to come. One tribe out of all the 12 remained faithful to God somewhat, and that was the Judea. That's where the word Jew comes from. And a small remnant of the tribe of Benjamin. That's it. So this renegade who comes from the northern territory of Galilee, But if they had taken the time to research the history, they'd find out he was born in the same city King David was. See, all of these things that happened ahead of time were necessary to prove the Epiphany. And Satan had done such a good job in distorting it, they wouldn't believe it. So that Andrew went out to evangelize, brought his friend Nathanael to Jesus by saying, Eureka! We found Messiah, Jesus from Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? We think of that at the time of our football games when we have the rivalry. Can anything good come from Michigan? Me. Because he's thinking back in his mind all the prophecies and everything. Oh no, the Messiah is supposed to come from Judea. Andrew didn't argue. Andrew is the true Christian. He didn't use the scriptures to argue. Come on and see. Come see for yourself. That's how we evangelize. My Lord and my God, he says. Jesus says, you're going to see some really cool things later. Yeah. Yeah, you think that's amazing? Just wait and see. Yeah. Things have been so distorted. All right. Luke chapter 24 is all about the scriptures. That's only about one thing. It's about Jesus. Law and the prophets, they called it. Acts chapter 28, the early church used what we call Old Testament to prove Jesus was Messiah. Why do we say it's obsolete today? Another huge distortion. If you don't have that, you don't have the first Epiphany. If you don't have the first Epiphany, you're not ready for the second one. Satan working again. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. All of the promises of God find their yes or their fulfillment in him. Because that's what it's all about. And I used to have a picture there on my slide presentation. I felt pretty proud of myself, put it together. But I had Jesus in the middle, an arrow pointing this way and an arrow pointing this way. All of what we call Old Testament is talking about him. All of what we call New Testament is reminding us of him. All of history is focused on one person and one event. So Paul could say, I only want to know one thing among you, Christ, and him scandalously crucified. Oh, really? Your God came to earth as one of you and your own people lynched him? Ah, get out of here. Your much learning has driven you insane. Paul says, but that's our message. There isn't another one. Again, you can't make that up. So, okay. Here are some of the Old Testament prophecies, and I can't give you too much detail, but man, they are a single lesson in and of themselves. A full study on each one. And on the back, take a look. This is a quotation from Science Speaks, a journal that used to be written back in the 1960s, written this here by Peter Stoner in 1963. You guys, yeah, I was 3 at the time. So, okay. He says, what are the odds? Jesus had to fulfill more than 300 prophecies. And by more than, there are still some that are hidden that we haven't noticed in 1963, and that is still true today, 63 years later. More than 300 prophecies in one lifetime. What are the odds that one life can do it? All 300 plus. He says just fulfilling 8 would be 1 to 10 with the 17th power. Try to figure out that kind of a number. And that would be the odds of that happening in one life. And of course, some people who are into betting, well, if there's one chance, I'm taking it. Now, Peter Stoner says, just to put it in your mind what that's like. Jesus fulfilled more than 300 Old Testament prophecies. Peter Stoner in Science Speaks, Moody Press, 1963, calculates the odds of fulfilling only 8 prophecies as 1 in 10 to the 17th power, or all those zeros. He suggested that if one covered the state of Texas, he must have been from Texas, with that many silver dollars, you remember a silver dollar? That was made out of real silver. Not today. All right. The entire state would be covered in coins 2 feet deep. Mark one of the coins, mix thoroughly, then blindfold a man and tell him to pick up the marked coin on the first try. That would be the same probability of just 8 of the messianic prophecies coming true by coincidence. He fulfilled over 300 and had to, because once it was prophesied, he says we have to do this to fulfill all righteousness. That's what he told John when he was baptized. You don't need to be baptized. I need to be baptized by you. No, we need to fulfill all righteousness. There was prophecies. Even what we would think are the mundane thing has to be done. Once God says it, that's the way it has to be. Satan, to say any of them didn't matter, a distortion, and we're messed up. And Jesus is not the true Messiah. All right. First prophecy of the coming of Jesus, his first epiphany, is the curse on the serpent. You'll bruise his heel, not a fatal wound. You're going to cry. The descendant of the woman is going to crush your head. A fatal wound. And in the book of Revelation, I think I left it there for you. No, I didn't. Revelation chapter 13, verses 3 and 12 describe the beast as having a mortal wound that had healed over, but it was obvious he was trying to disguise it. That's reference back to Genesis chapter 3. And that was a promise fulfilled when Jesus died on the cross. And he yelled out his last word. English has 3. It's finished. It's done. I did it. You couldn't stop me. But there was one more yet to do, wasn't there? The reason why the Jews begged Pilate for a guard and to seal the tomb, that was Satan again. Jesus said one miracle would prove everything about him true, the sign of Jonah. The religious leaders, sign of Jonah? The one prophet who refused his assignment and got swallowed and then barfed up on the beach and had to go back and then complained about it? Yeah, just as Jonah was inside the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, Son of Man is going to be inside the earth 3 days and 3 nights. If the resurrection doesn't happen, go out and do whatever you like. I'm a fraud. But if it does, Satan incited the Jews and Pilate to seal that tomb. Probably in wax all around the stone. Probably with a seal of some kind that'd have to be clipped. And then 4 trained killers, murderers, sitting outside, whose only job was to make sure that body wasn't stolen. And they only had to do it for 3 days. Everybody would love that job. That guard duty's a piece of cake. Until the angels appeared. And they ran off. And were told by the Jews, they were paid off and said, tell them that the disciples stole the body while we fell asleep. Well, if you're asleep, how do you know who it was? And secondly, you fell asleep on guard duty? But they had blackmail on Pilate, and it spared their lives. And who knows? There are a lot of people suggesting that those 4 guys might have been part of the Pentecost Day baptisms. Because they knew that stone wasn't just moved back far enough for someone to get in and drag a body out. Okay. Anyway, you see how you can, each one of those is a main story, and you can't just dwell on it forever. The promises to Abraham. And I'm only giving you the main events as I see them, the main prophecies that drove the New Testament Gospels. Matthew especially was written to the Jewish audience, and these are the main ones he stuck with. His descendant would be a blessing for all nations. In Genesis chapter 12, you can also look at Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, where God says the same thing. In Galatians, Paul says his promise was to his seed. 1. Not seeds, many. 1 descendant would bless all nations. Revelation chapter 7, it's 144,000. John heard the number. It was a symbolic number. Not a literal 144,000, so that if you were number 144,001, sorry, no room at the inn. Maybe you have to wait for someone to leave. You're out of luck. No. John, there in chapter 7, verse 9, says he turned and looked to see, and there was a crowd of people that humans cannot count. Take a look at that number on the back that I gave you. It's pretty much like that. So it's not. And he said they were from all nations, every tribe, every nation, every race, every people, not just one. How has Satan distorted that today? We have a lobby in Washington that backs one nation over in the Middle East because they think that when Jesus comes again, they're going to have favored nation status. And if we're good to him, then we get a good spot in heaven, not one of the lowly spots. Did you know there was a lobby in Washington over that? Every nation. No one's going to have better status than anybody else. We're all on the same level. We're all the inheriting son through Jesus Christ. All right. And also then, when he sacrificed Isaac, take your son, your only son whom you love. And that word for love isn't just the emotion, love. That was the primogeniture contract. Primogeniture would be the heir who would take over the estate. So when God says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, it's not the emotion. It's who was chosen to inherit. Now, from an earthly standpoint, Esau got it all. He was the oldest son. Jacob ran away. He did not have to trick his father out of the birthright, or his brother. Now, God had already chosen Jacob. Spiritual inheritor. That's the word for love there. Take your only son, the one you love, the one who will be your heir, and sacrifice him to God. What's that sound like? You promised me he would inherit. That shows you the faith of Abraham. God said it and promised it. Abraham went through with it anyway. Hebrews, the writer there, said Isaac was as good as dead. In Abraham's mind, he thought God was going to raise him from the dead. Now, who would have ever thought that in Abraham's day? That shows you the faith of Abraham. Isaac was not a little kid either. He was not a boy. He could have fought back. But his father must have taught him well, because his father bound him, put him on the altar. On the way, though, Isaac said, Dad, we got the wood. We got the fire. I think we forgot something. No, the Lord himself, Yahweh himself, will provide the sacrifice. Do you know where Abraham was led to go for that sacrifice? One of the mountains of Moriah. Jerusalem is on Mount Moriah. Jerusalem is the name Yahweh of peace, God of peace, Jerusalem. That's where David offered the sacrifice to stop the plague, on the threshing floor of Arana that he bought because he would not offer to God sacrifices that cost him nothing. The same spot years later when Jesus started his ministry, where he was crucified. God offered his one and only son, the son he loved, as the inheritor. Same place. Deuteronomy 18, a prophet like Moses, one of the people of Jerusalem, one of the people of Israel, will take over. And you read Matthew's gospel, and it's a constant comparison of Jesus to what Moses did. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is the son of David. So in the genealogies you have in Matthew and in Luke, he's related to Abraham and David. Both of them trace his lineage to David and to Abraham. Different names, though, following David, which lead many to believe that Luke's genealogy is actually Mary and not Joseph. Okay. Anyway, Isaiah, the Messianic prophet. He's the most quoted prophet in the New Testament. Isaiah chapter 53. That's what the Ethiopian eunuch was reading from. Because his hopes were totally dashed with their distorted view of the prophecies. And he was so discouraged, like the other apostles, they went back to fishing. It's over. And he's going back over it again, and he's reading Isaiah 53. Read that. It's a perfect description of Jesus, the suffering servant. The Jews had come up with the idea that there were two people there. One who would suffer at the hands of the occupation and rally the one who was anointed by God as the Messiah to come and drive them out of there and reestablish the throne of David. Not realizing that the actual truth Isaiah was inspired to write about was one guy would do those two things. He would suffer our punishment for sin, but then in raising from the dead, be the eternal king. And the eunuch could not figure this out. Philip says, you understand what you're talking about? No. Is he talking about the prophet talking about himself or someone else? Because obviously the guy we thought he was talking about is gone. Dead. And from that scripture, Philip went back through the prophecies, showed him how Jesus fulfilled all of them. He says, here's water. I need to be baptized in Christ. Isaiah 53. Whole bunch of others that go along with it. The timing of Daniel's prophecies. With the image of the great king, said that it would be during the time of the Roman kings it would happen. So what are they still looking for today? Roman kings are long gone. Also, he actually timed the year. The Messiah's death would be 490 years, 77s, from the rebuilding of the temple. The call to rebuild, finally, when they finished it, the call went out at 457 BC. If you subtract that from 490, you come up with 33. Daniel actually prophesied through divine intervention the year Jesus was crucified. He would seal up all inspired writing. No more sacrificing and offering. Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones. People thought being in Babylon, it was all over. We're going to rot here in the desert. And so he had this vision of these bones that had been laying there. And as soon as he started preaching to them through the prophets, the bones came together. Foot bone connected to ankle bone connected to knee bone. And then flesh came on them. They were still just dead bodies. So God told him, all right, start prophesying to the Spirit. And when he did, the Spirit entered them. They became human beings and stood up a vast army. Another prophecy. When Christ came, brought them back from death, a huge army for God. That's a great story. And then the return of Elijah in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Easy to remember. Malachi, the last one, 4, 5, 6. The return of Elijah. Because Elijah never died, did he? He went up to heaven in a glowing chariot, a glowing limousine. Their prophecy through Malachi, they got that part right, but it was totally distorted. They thought Elijah literally was coming back. But Jesus, in the passages I give you there in Matthew and Mark, well, yeah, I said, why did the prophet say that Elijah comes first? He said, well, he did. And they killed him. They realized then, he's talking John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn the people back to God, to listen to the true one. So when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, we had Moses, the lawgiver. We had Elijah, the one who would return as the herald and the chronicler. And Peter, in his impetuousness, "Oh, let's build shrines to Moses and Elijah too, and we'll worship them." And the Spirit from God says, "No. This is my Son whom I love, my inheritor. You will listen to him." Again, one of the preparations for Messiah. We've run out of time, but next week we'll start, and then I'll show you some other things, because after the scriptures were written and inspired in the first covenant, until the time Jesus came, we don't have any information in Scripture. It's all in history. But God was really busy putting the final preparations in place. So we'll look at those then. You can look down here at the Old Testament symbols. We'll touch on those as we start next week. Very interesting stuff to me. I hope it is to you as well. Hope. God is coming back. That's one of the three things that keep us going: faith, hope, and love. So during this week, think about how God has promised, and he's never failed on a promise. Keep your hope alive. We'll talk more next week then.